Good morning and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. Our urban community welcomes all with love, supports learning and spiritual growth, serves our wider community, and works for justice, equity, and inclusion. My name is Reverend Connie Simon, and I'm glad that you're here. If you'd like to learn more about our community or any of our programs, please email us at member-care@firstuu.com. We begin our service by lighting our chalice, the chosen symbol of our faith. This morning we do so in remembrance of Memorial Day with these words by Reverend Dr. Cynthia Landrum. In honor of those who have served and those who continue to serve at home and abroad, for peace and in war, we light our chalice and we offer our thanks.
We are
Every week, we honor the joys and the sorrows and the moments of gladness and sadness that have been part of the cycle of life since last we were together. This morning, we are grateful for a blue sky, for clear air, and for comfortable temperatures. We are at the same time, though, aware that in other parts of the world, other parts of this country, things aren't so great. There has been yet another shooting, one in San Jose, one in Florida. Gun violence continues to plague our nation. There have been more instances of racial and sexual orientation-based oppression in the world. The things that are difficult to imagine being part of a world so beautiful. How can these things continue to happen? And yet they do. Within the walls of this community, we do have a joy to celebrate. The anniversary of Al and Carol Lloyd. You see their picture below when they were younger, and they send that to us to enjoy this morning along with the message, we're still crazy after all these years. We need messages like that, especially this week. It's been a difficult week at First Church. It's been a difficult few days here at First Church. We've seen our relationships strained. We've seen confusion and despair and frustration and anger. All of the things that happen in life, because remember, we are human beings here in this space. And still, we continue to love one another and support one another and hold one another. And to remind us of that, I want to share a special prayer with you and show you an image of what I believe personifies First Church. People joining together hand in love, in community. Holding Reality and Possibility Together by Sam Trumbore. I invite you now into a time of gratitude, reflection, renewal, and hope. What an unearned blessing to delight in the calming peace of this space, to hear the robin's song again at daybreak, to feel the warmth in this room, and to enjoy the promise of summer almost upon us. Each moment of wakefulness has so many gifts that offer energy and delight. Yet too often they seem unavailable as the weight of our troubles press down on us. The threats to our well-being, real or exaggerated, feel like mosquitoes in the night looking for a place to land. Minds become captive to rising floodwaters, forceful, murky, threatening, and ominous. Even in moments of great danger, the direction of attention is a choice. Fear can dominate the mind, binding it like a straitjacket, or love can unbind it and open it to resource and opportunity. The soil of the mind can be watered with kindness. The thorns can be removed one by one to appreciate the buds ready to flower. Great possibilities await us, even if all we can see is the cliff before us. The grandeur of life, of which we are a part, scatters rainbows in every direction, even as the deluge approaches. Holding reality and possibility together is the holy, hope-filled work of humanity, if we choose it again and again in love. We'll now drop a stone in our healing water and enjoy a moment of silent meditation, reflection, and prayer. To support the work of this church, both inside and outside our walls, our offering will now be gratefully received. You can donate by text by sending the message GIVE to 513-717-7373. If you prefer to write a check, please make it payable to First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. On the memo line, you can write in donation or South Avondale Elementary, because we are sharing our plate with South Avondale Elementary School tutoring and literacy efforts. You may also make your donation online at firstuu.com or through the Breeze member system at any time. As I mentioned, through the month of May, through tomorrow, we will be accepting those donations for South Avondale Elementary programs. If this is your first time visiting, please let the virtual plate pass you by. Your presence is your gift to us.
Unspeakable: The Tulsa Race Massacre by Carol Boston Weatherford. Illustrated by Floyd Cooper. Once upon a time, near Tulsa, Oklahoma, prospectors struck it rich in the oil fields. The wealth created jobs, raised buildings, and attracted newcomers from far and wide, seeking fortune and a fresh start. Once upon a time in Tulsa, there was a community called Greenwood. The residents descended from Black Indians, from formerly enslaved people, and from exodusters who moved west in the late 1800s, fleeing the violence and racism of the segregated South. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were some 10,000 people living in a 35 square block area. Train tracks divided the Black and white communities. Segregation laws called for separate neighborhoods, schools, phone booths, and railroad and streetcar coaches. Unfair tests made it hard for blacks to register to vote, and laws barred marriages across racial lines. So many black businesses cropped up along a 1-mile stretch of Greenwood Avenue that educator and business leader Booker T. Washington called the area the Negro Wall Street of America. The name later became Black Wall Street, and the community kept thriving. Once upon a time on Black Wall Street, there were dozens of restaurants and grocery stores. There were furriers, a pool hall, a bus system, and an auto shop. Nearly 200 businesses in all. There were also several libraries, a hospital, a post office, and a separate school system, where some say black children got a better education than whites. There were 2 black-owned newspapers, the Tulsa Star and Oklahoma Sun, and over 20 churches, and 15 black doctors, including Dr. A.C. Jackson, the most able black surgeon in the nation. On Detroit Avenue stood grand homes of doctors, lawyers, and prominent businessmen. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were barber shops and beauty salons. Miss Mabel's Little Rose Beauty Salon boomed on Thursdays when maids who worked for white families got coiffed on their day off and strutted in style up and down Greenwood Avenue. The soda fountain at Williams Confectionery was the backdrop for scores of marriage proposals. And there was a luxurious Stratford Hotel, then the largest black-owned hotel in the nation. Black guests were welcome there, even as they were barred from Tulsa's white hotels. Once upon a time in Greenwood, there were 2 movie theaters, including the 800-seat black-owned Dreamland. There were even 6 privately owned airplanes. But in 1921, not everyone in Tulsa was pleased with these signs of black wealth. Undeniable proof that African Americans could achieve just as much, if not more than, whites. All it took was one elevator ride. One 17-year-old white elevator operator accusing a 19-year-old black shoeshine man of assault for simmering hatred to boil over. With the accused man in jail, the white-owned Tulsa Tribune newspaper ran a headline prompting readers to, quote-unquote, nab him. Fearing the man would be lynched, killed by a mob before his trial, 30 armed black men rushed downtown to his rescue. At the jail, they faced off with 200 armed whites. On May 31st, 1921, one day after Memorial Day, a holiday honoring fallen soldiers, skirmishes between the 2 groups left 2 black men and 10 white men dead. But the worst was yet to come. Unable to get to the jailed suspect, the white mob sparked rumors that the black community planned to attack. Unchecked and, in some cases, deputized by the police, the white mob stormed into Greenwood, looting and burning homes and businesses that blacks had saved and sacrifice to build, threatening to shoot the mob-blocked firefighters from putting out the blazes. African American World War I veterans took up arms to defend their families and property, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Families fled with only what they could carry. Once upon a time, in Greenwood, up to 300 Black people, including Dr. Jackson, were killed. Hundreds more were injured. More than 8,000 people were left homeless. And hundreds of businesses and other establishments were reduced to ash. The police did nothing to protect the Black community. When the National Guard arrived the next day, all that was left to do was put out fires and move thousands of Black residents into camps outside of Tulsa. As their community lay in ruins, Black residents had to carry passes to enter the city. In the days and weeks that followed, some Black Tulsans left and never returned. Others stayed and rebuilt the Greenwood community, only to witness its decline in the 1960s. For decades, survivors did not speak of the terror. 75 years passed before lawmakers launched an investigation to uncover the painful truth about the worst racial attack in United States history. Police and city officials had plotted with the white mob to destroy the nation's wealthiest Black community. Today, Tulsa's Reconciliation Park remembers victims of the 1921 massacre and recalls the role of African Americans in Oklahoma history. But the park is not just a bronze monument to the past. It is a place to realize the responsibility we all have to reject hatred and violence and to instead choose hope. I wonder if you've ever heard this story before. And I wonder what other stories are out there that we have yet to hear.
Have you ever heard the story of the Tulsa Massacre? What other stories are out there that we haven't heard yet? Too many. The story of the attack on Greenwood, or the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, is a story we should all know. It is as much American history as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere or the Battle of Gettysburg. Yet many of us don't know about it or any of the other events that happened before and after it. They are hard stories to hear, yet they're important for all of us to hear. Some of what I'm going to say today might not be appropriate for young or sensitive audience members. So I tell you now that listener and viewer discretion is advised. I will also tell you that in reading these stories again, because these are not new stories to me, I felt a sense of despair at having to decide which stories to mention and which stories to leave out to fit the time allotted for this service. And I decided that this is going to be a two-part sermon. And that today we're going to talk only about these stories and let these stories be heard. And when we come together in 2 weeks on June 13th, we'll talk about the impact of these events on our world today. We'll talk about the things that are happening in Avondale and in other areas around the country. But for now, we need to go back in time. You see, for a brief time following the end of the Civil War, newly freed Black people in America had a taste of freedom and opportunity in this country. We could vote, we could hold office. Many of us were buying property, we were enrolling in college, we were starting farms and businesses. Some became quite successful economically. The fact that Blacks were not only free, but that some were succeeding elicited feelings of resentment among many white Americans, particularly those in the South. As a result, we saw the enactment of Black codes and Jim Crow laws that took away those hard-earned voting rights, imposed restriction and control over where Blacks could live, how and where they could travel, and what they could own. They made life very difficult. These laws effectively legalized racial segregation and denied opportunity to Black citizens. Now, one might think that this would violate our Constitution, but the Supreme Court, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, ruled, no, it's okay. Separate but equal facilities are not unconstitutional. Although the question of what an equal facility is was never really answered. During this time, we also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan originally started in 1865 as a private club for Confederate veterans and soon morphed into an extremist right-wing white supremacy organization. Its members included all levels of white society, from the most wealthy and powerful to the average worker. I don't need to tell you about the hatred of the Klan toward not only Blacks, but also Jews, Muslims, immigrants, and homosexuals, or about their tactics of intimidation and terror. Although at this time we're talking about now, in the latter part of the 1800s, the bulk of their rage was directed at Blacks. It's in this atmosphere that one of the first racial massacres occurred in New Orleans. On July 30th, 1866, a group of Black freedmen was peacefully protesting a state law that proposed to refuse to give voting rights to Black men. The Black men were protesting this taking away of their rights. During the meeting of the state constitutional convention, right outside the convention hall, a group composed largely of anti-abolitionists and ex-Confederate soldiers set upon the Black protesters. According to author Ron Chernow in his 2017 biography of Ulysses S. Grant, the whites stomped, kicked, and clubbed the Black marchers mercilessly. Policemen smashed the Institute's windows and fired into it indiscriminately until the floor grew slick with blood. They emptied their revolvers on the convention delegates who desperately sought to escape. Some leaped from windows and were shot dead where they landed. Those lying wounded on the ground were stabbed repeatedly, their skulls bashed in with brickbats. The sadism was so wanton that men who kneeled and prayed for mercy were killed instantly, while dead bodies were stabbed and mutilated. 50 black people were killed, 159 were wounded. 3 whites died. On Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, somewhere between 60 and 159 black militiamen were killed by a mob of former Confederate soldiers, members of the KKK and the White League, in a confrontation over the 1872 contested gubernatorial election. The number of black victims cannot be verified because many of the bodies were thrown into the Red River or disposed of in mass graves. We have no way of knowing exactly how many were killed or what happened to them. By 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, blacks held rising political and economic power. 3 of the city's aldermen were black, and black people could be found at all levels of civil servant positions, such as teachers and postmen and coroners, etc. According to historian Leon H. Prather Sr., writing in Democracy Betrayed, the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898 and its legacy, in a city of only 25,000, blacks accounted for over 30% of Wilmington's skilled craftsmen. They owned 10 of the city's 11 restaurants. They were 90% of the city's barbers and represented 1/3 of Wilmington's butchers and half its tailors. More than 2,000 blacks held professional positions. As you can imagine, tensions grew as white resentment rose. The Democratic State Party chairman launched a white supremacy campaign, and that is what he called it. He summarized it this way: North Carolina is a white man's state, and white men will rule it, and they will crush the party of Negro domination beneath a majority so overwhelming that no other party will ever dare to attempt Negro rule here. This campaign spurred the creation of groups known as the White Government Union and led to the, quote, White Supremacy Convention in Goldsboro, which was attended by a crowd of more than 8,000, and led to the signing of a proclamation by 457 people that was delivered to the Committee of Colored Citizens, which was a group of 32 prominent blacks, along with the instruction that they fall in line with the proclamation's demands. When the Committee of Colored Citizens didn't respond within 24 hours as requested, more than 500 white businessmen carrying guns taken from the city armory burned and destroyed the offices of the city's black newspaper. Growing to more than 2,000, the mob spread and went into black neighborhoods, destroying businesses and property and homes and churches and assaulting every black person they found. Reverend J. Allen Kirk, a white man, wrote, "It was a great sight to see them marching from death, and the colored women, colored men, colored children, colored enterprises, and colored people all exposed to death. Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The woods were filled with colored people. The streets were dotted with their dead bodies. They went from house to house looking for Negroes that they considered offensive, took arms they had hidden, and killed them for the least expression of manhood. Negro stores were closed and the owners thereof driven out of the city and even shipped away at the point of a gun. A similar story occurred in Atlanta in 1906, when candidates for the 1906 governor's race exploited white fears of a black upper class. How dare they gain property? How dare they be so uppity? Hoke Smith, the former publisher of the Atlanta Journal, insisted that black disenfranchisement was necessary to ensure that blacks were kept in their place, that is, in a position inferior to that of whites. Author Gregory Mixon says that on Saturday, September 22nd, Atlanta newspapers reported 4 alleged assaults, none of which were ever substantiated, upon local white women. Extra editions of these accounts, sensationalized with lurid details and inflammatory language intended to inspire fear, if not revenge, circulated, and soon thousands of white men and boys gathered in downtown Atlanta. By early evening, the crowd had become a mob. From then until midnight, they surged throughout the central business district, assaulting hundreds of blacks. The crowd also attacked streetcars, entering trolley cars, and beating black men and women. The militia was summoned around midnight, but the mob showed no signs of letting up until a heavy rain began to fall at 2 a.m. that finally dispersed the crowd. The next day, white vigilante groups invaded black neighborhoods. On Monday, the 24th, a heavily armed group of African Americans held a meeting in nearby Brownsville. When police learned of the gathering, they feared a counterattack and launched a raid. A shootout ensued, and an officer was killed. More than 250 African Americans were arrested, and race relations in Atlanta were forever affected. Let's revisit where we were in the early 19-teens. Blacks were leaving the South, seeking opportunities in northern cities. Immigrants were coming here as well, fleeing the war in Europe. Even though the population was growing as industrialization ramped up, these demographic shifts added even more kindling to the flames of racism. We saw increased labor disputes, as striking laborers were often replaced by people of color on factory floors and in farms and in other areas, thus encouraging racism and resentment. In April 1917, the mostly white workers of the Aluminum Ore Company in East St. Louis, Illinois, went on strike. The company hired hundreds of black workers as replacements. After a report that an armed black man had attempted to rob a white woman in early June, Allison Keyes, a writer, says that mobs started beating any African Americans they found, even pulling individuals off streetcars and trolleys. On July 1, a white man in a car shot into black homes, killing 2 men who turned out to be police officers investigating the shooting. The next morning, whites poured out of a meeting and began beating blacks with guns, rocks, and pipes. They set fire to homes and shot residents as they fled their burning properties. Reporter Carlos Hurd wrote in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that the East St. Louis affair, as I saw it, was a manhunt, conducted on a sporting basis, though with anything but the fair play, which is the principle of sport. There was a horribly cool deliberateness and a spirit of fun about it. After church that morning, whites were headed into the so-called American Quarter. One black resident recalls his uncle's stories of that day. Uncle Eddie and some of the other young men were armed. He had a squirrel rifle. They staked out in front of our home and warded off the marauding white mob as they came down our street. They had to take cover because the white men were shooting at them. There was a standoff, if you will, and I understand from my uncle that it seemed to last for hours. They witnessed the burning of homes and people. People were hanged as well. By early Monday morning, the whole neighborhood was on fire. The family decided to run for the river under the cover of darkness. It took 4 hours to get across that river. They fashioned a raft out of old doors and charred wood to cross the Mississippi River and get to the St. Louis side. The raft sprung leaks, but they were able to get across. As many as 250 blacks were murdered and another 6,000 left homeless. The violence didn't stop. It only got worse, exploding during 1919 in what was known as the Red Summer. From April to November, attacks on blacks occurred in dozens of cities. Here are just a few. April 13th, rural Jenkins County, Georgia. Hundreds of white men attacked the black community, burning 7 black churches and 3 Masonic lodges. 2 white men and 4 blacks were killed. May 10th, 5 white soldiers in Charleston, South Carolina, alleged that they'd been cheated by a black man and began attacking blacks at random. Stores were ransacked, black businesses and homes were damaged. 6 blacks were killed and 17 injured. July 10th through the 12th, whites attacked black areas of town and burned several properties, including the homes of a black doctor and teacher. 1 black man was shot and killed. During the time July 19th through the 23rd, mobs of white men, many in military uniform, randomly beat black people on the street and attacked black homes and businesses in Washington, D.C. in response to a rumor that a black man had raped a white woman. Kenneth Ackerman wrote, "When the violence ended, a total of 15 people had died, 10 white people, including 2 police officers, and 5 blacks. 50 people were seriously wounded, while another 100 were less severely wounded. It would be one of the few times in 20th century white on black riots that white fatalities outnumbered those of black people." July 21st, a white mob attacked a homecoming for African American World War I veterans in Norfolk, Virginia. 6 were shot, and Marines had to be called in to quell the violence. July 27th, a black youth swam into a whites-only beach area on Lake Michigan outside Chicago and was stoned and drowned. Young black men protested when police refused to act, setting off 2 weeks of violence. White mobs destroyed black homes and businesses on the south side of Chicago, resulting in the end in 23 blacks killed, 527 injured, and 1,000 black families left homeless. At the end of August, a white mob attacked the African American business district in Knoxville, Tennessee, after the arrest of a black suspect on suspicion of murdering a white woman. 7 were killed and more than 20 wounded. September 28th, a mob of over 10,000 whites burned the county courthouse in Omaha, Nebraska, to force the release of Will Brown, a black man accused of raping a white woman. They lynched him and burned his body, then spread out to attack and burn black neighborhoods and stores over the next 48 hours. On September 30th, white planters in Elaine, Arkansas, protested efforts of black sharecroppers to organize. Hundreds of whites joined them from the surrounding areas as they attacked black people over 2 days at random, killing as many as 237. The Red Summer did eventually end in late November 1919, but the violence didn't stop. We know that the Tulsa Massacre happened in 1921, and then just a few years later, on New Year's Day in Rosewood, Florida, was destroyed by a white mob instigated by the rumor that a white woman had been sexually assaulted by a black man. People and livestock were slaughtered. Only 2 buildings in the town remain standing. It hurts my heart to read these stories. And some may be wondering, why is she just recounting these stories? Because we need to hear them. We have to know our past to appreciate where we are today. And I don't mean appreciate with gratitude, I mean to understand where we are today and why our world is as it is today. The message then was clear. We don't want your kind here. And I dare say that none felt it as strongly as black veterans returning from World War I. In May of 2019, during that Red Summer, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in an essay called Returning Soldiers, "We return from the slavery of uniform which the world's madness demanded us to don to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing, this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting." Yes, the message was clear. We don't want your kind here. We don't want your kind here or anywhere else. These stories truly are hard to hear, and you only heard a few, not the things that happened in all 36 cities. And surely, we say to ourselves, things are different now, right? Well, yes and no. 100 years ago, the aggressors would just kill you or just burn your house down. Just burn your house down. But things are different now. The tactics are different. But in many ways, the message is still the same. We don't want your kind here. Or your kind is not acceptable here. We don't want you to take away our culture, our comfort, our way of life. We don't want you changing our communities. We like them just the way they are. Thank you very much. In many of these stories, in American history, we see the roots of colonialism, of classism, of racism in America, of suppression of those who don't fit the norms of society or the perceived norms of society. This is what we are speaking of when we talk about white supremacy culture. A culture that favors whiteness over all else. A culture that privileges property, ownership, higher education, wealth above all else. Yet at the same time, one that systemically prevents people of color and those with marginalized identities from achieving those things. We see it today in the economic policies, in the financial policies of our cities and towns, of our federal government in many ways. We see it in the gentrification of our neighborhoods. I think that to fully understand where we are today, we needed to step back in time a little bit, to understand the roots of how we got here, to understand the roots of our culture, to understand and to hear the horror of these stories. We've always experienced these horrors as Black people, as people of color. And it's not just us. We're seeing it these days, suffered by Asian Americans, by Latinx folks, by immigrants, by people who have non-conforming gender identities and different sexual orientations. We have to make change. It's not acceptable anymore to say, we don't want your kind here. It's simply not acceptable. And when we return on June 13th, we'll talk about how this history has affected the development of our cities and towns, of our societies now in the 21st century, and talk about what we can do to change it. Amen.
It's a never-ending game. You only realize that nothing's alright when you're dreaming of a better time. Bullets fly, and it seems like this moment isn't passing by. The battle isn't lost. Enough is enough. We're gonna raise up, 'cause it's time to talk. There's blood on the street. It's time to defeat this hate, and racism has to leave. You decide if it's time to breathe or if it's time to leave. We've wasted time. Still goes around. It's common sense that people say we're breaking free and turn away, and that is why you see devastation in this town. But tomorrow there will be another day. Tomorrow there will be another. I hope that unity was found. What comes around still goes around. It's common sense that people say breaking free and turn away, and that is why you see devastation in this town. But tomorrow there will be another day. Tomorrow there will be another day. Tomorrow there will be another day.
Let us extinguish our chalice by reciting together the words that appear on your screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. A few announcements. Our What is a Microaggression workshop has been rescheduled. The new date is Tuesday, June 8th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. on Zoom. If you're curious as to what microaggressions are, or if you need assistance and education or need practice in learning how to disrupt them and interrupt them, this is the workshop for you. For registration information, please email member-care@firstuu.com.